So, welcome to this edition of Rule Breakers, and I'm delighted to say that with me today is Tony Coates from not so sunny London at the moment. How are you doing, Tony?
Oh, fine. Yourself.
Good, good. Yeah, it's been quite some time since we've spoken. Many, many years, I think, since I don't know, some conference somewhere.
Oh,
Uh,
yes. It's probably like 15 odd years or something,
Must be.
seriously. Hmm.
I'm trying to remember what I typically do with all of these is trying to think back to, when I first met various people. I think in your case, I think you came over from London, I believe, to we'd celebrate
Yes.
XML.
So, yes.
Remember that?
Because I was in London I've been in London in the UK for 25 years now. So I came
Hmm.
over in mid 2000. Reuters brought me over. And part of my job at that stage was to fly to XML conferences.
Right.
So I started doing XML conferences in the second half of 2000. So,
Okay.
any time from then, really, you could have met me.
Yeah, yeah. I think we'd set up a an XML interest group or something in Dublin back in the day, and I seem to
Oh,
remember it was
yes. So I did come over to talk there. Yes, because I also remember being with Simon, what is his name, who works for the open source license.
Simon Phipps, is
Yes,
it?
Simon Phipps, that's right. And I remember Simon particularly because that was the first time I'd ever been in Ireland, and we were
Okay.
going out to dinner, and I thought finally I'll try some fine Irish cuisine.
Mm.
And he said we must go to this sushi place in Dublin. It's fantastic. So my first taste of Irish food was sushi.
With sushi.
Yeah.
Very good, very good. I think it's, obviously there's lots and lots of different strands to this whole idea of data models and data modeling and syntaxes for data exchange and so on. But I think it's fair to say that of the work that what you were particularly interested in was standards for structured information exchange as opposed to traditional documents. Is that fair to say?
Yes, yes, pretty much. I was working for Reuters when I came over, and so there was a little bit of an aspect. I did some work around NewsML, which was their way of capturing news articles.
Mm.
Um, and if you search for NewsML and RFC, you'll find the one RFC I wrote defining the NewsML URN namespace. Um, Not that anyone has ever cared much about URN namespaces and how you're supposed to use them properly. They just write
Right,
URN colon at the start and then go for broke. Anyway,
right, right.
but yeah, mostly what we were doing was structured information, and I felt that, to be honest, when I went to the XML conferences, that most
Mm.
people were there from a publishing background. I seemed to be categorized as, the banking guy who turned up
Okay.
at the conferences. And so, whereas I could understand James Clark's comments, because it was always like that, he sees it in a very document centric way.
Mm.
I've always come into it from a point of view where I'm very friendly towards XML schema because it does impose an object oriented view onto
Right.
XML. And so that's very convenient if you think you're going to use it to create objects, or if also in some ways for writing APIs around it. So, and a lot of the early things that people did were around generating classes off
Right.
XML schemas, um, which was a big thing, and probably also a bad thing. I remember a friend of mine who's a big Oracle expert saying to me once that the XML world, failed to learn the lessons of the relational database world. Just as I think you were talking recently about the JSON people not taking on the lessons of the XML people. That's
Right.
just
Right.
a continuing thing in history. I do think actually that the problem is that when somebody new comes into the frame, it's a bit much to expect them to learn all of the previous history that ever
Right.
happened. And at some point, you just have to truncate and say, I'm just going to pretend this stuff didn't happen. I'm going to rediscover things for myself. So,
Right. Right. Right.
but anyway, his point was that if you think back to the 80s, Microsoft had these frameworks for constructing C++ code for your
Mm.
relational databases, and they were built off the physical schema of the database, and they were fantastic until you changed something, and then they just
Right.
broke into many pieces. And so he said that was the thing that really got them using SQL, was the fact that you needed some intermediary between the physical structure of the database and what you're returning to the program, so that you had some layer in between where if the physical schema changed, you could adjust it so the software didn't have to see the difference. It didn't have to be broken by it.
Right.
And
Right.
I guess if we'd taken that approach, we would have been more likely to get people to use XPaths more and to use XQuery more in the way they extract it. But actually, even now, I just saw someone today asking for help getting their JAXB libraries to work. And,
Yeah.
so there's still a lot of Java that's hard coded off XML
Right. Right.
schemas. And, everything good and bad that comes with it, I guess.
Indeed. Yeah. Yeah. I do remember being a little bit horrified, I must admit, when I first saw those, XML serialization things, because I mean, XML is suboptimal at best for a lot of object serialization use cases. Uh,
Well, yes. So here's the thing. I've sometimes, over drinks with my XML friends, tried to have the discussion of what were the reasons that were XML's breakout reasons, the things that made it big at that point in time. Um, and I've never been able to get any agreement on the point. So I can only tell you what I think,
mm,
which is that there was a point where if you wanted to communicate information between two computers, before we had the web and things, it wasn't really that straightforward. So, and you had various OMG standards for doing binary calls between objects on different computers. But the problem with that was they used various ports that the bastard sysadmin would inevitably block,
lock. Sure.
and this would cripple you from trying being able to do anything. And
Right.
then we had this funny thing where the web arrives. And, I first probably saw it in 93 because I was doing physics and it comes out of physics. But then I guess by 96, you were starting to see URLs being printed in newspapers. So that's when you kind of knew the web was prime time. And what the web meant was that the CEO would phone up the bastard system administrator and say, no, that port 80, you're opening that one up. I'm going through that one myself. And so once port 80 was open, anything that could go through port 80
Right. Right. Right.
suddenly had that. And in my mind, that was the thing for XML. Well, one of the big things for XML, you could get it between different organizations in a much more
Right.
straightforward way than we've been able to previously.
Right.
And then you
Right.
had a few other concurrences, because Java, Sun, having done Java,
Mhm.
was selling XML as being the portable data framework to go with this portable code. So that was their marketing thing. Then you also had that around that time was really when open source software kind of became big as well. So, a lot of the early parsers for XML were open source, and I don't think any other
Right.
format has had that luxury in the past. So
That's true.
so it was very straightforward to get in that sense. So there was a number of these things I think came together at once. Now, is XML awkward for structured data? It is a bit, because you have elements and attributes. And the question is, how are you supposed to use those for structured data? If you've got a human readable document, there's a fairly clear rule that the content of the elements is the human readable content and the
Right.
metadata is the content of the attributes.
Attribute. Right.
But when you've just got some structured set of fields to represent, there's no clear guidance. And so attributes versus elements is just a continued confusion, because everyone would have their own ad hoc approach to it, really. And so
Right.
I can see why when JSON came along, a lot of people found it simpler for a lot of things, because you don't have that decision point that you have to worry about on every element.
Yeah. 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 Indeed. Indeed. I remember we were talking about the famous port wars and the opening up of port 80. Was it Dave Weiner at the time had XML RPC?
Oh, that's
Um,
right. Yeah.
and,
Mm.
and Dave Weiner's one liner was, does it have to be any more complicated than this? The idea was is that you could hit a URL,
Mm.
and you would get back hello world in an XML wrapper.
Yes.
And essentially, that was many orders of magnitude simpler than at the time things like DCOM and
And Corba. Yeah.
Corba. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's interesting. The whole JSON thing is interesting to me because it dovetails with something James Clark said about how, looking back on it now, one of the things that he misjudged was the extent to which JavaScript would basically explode.
Completely. And that really, I think that really goes back to Google's V8 JavaScript compiler
Right.
because it suddenly became fast. And so, to the point now where people will compile their Java across to JavaScript and still
Right.
consider that a performant thing to do.
Right.
That
Right. Right.
was definitely unimaginable. Um, by contrast, I can remember seeing James Gosling doing a presentation once and looking back a bit over the history of early Java and implementations. But he talked about JavaScript as well, and he said, well, in his mind in those days, he thought of Microsoft as evil. He thought of Netscape just as screwy. So, they came out of the blue and called this thing JavaScript, and then it wasn't Java. It barely
Mm.
resembled it. And then, but at the time, they didn't want to ruffle the feathers of Netscape too much because they were such a big thing in the browser world. So, it just went on. But yes, I'm amazed that JavaScript has survived, and it's actually just, blossomed to just being the way
Right.
people do interfaces now.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
fantastic. Yeah.
Incredible. Even just the other day, uh, I was looking for some way to get a validating XML parser into a browser window
Good.
in sort of a self-contained, single page application type thing.
Right.
And turns out that libxml2, which is written in C, there's a WebAssembly for it,
Oh,
so
yeah. Yeah. Mm.
yeah, there doesn't seem to be much left that can't now, in principle at least, manifest as a JavaScript library, either client side or server side. It's
Oh
amazing.
no, completely. And I mean, I thought it was interesting. It was quite some years ago now that the Saxonica people,
Right.
transcoded the Saxon Java stuff into both .NET and then into JavaScript. It's just
Right.
amazing that it works to do that.
Yeah.
Um, so and yeah, WebAssembly is well. I mean, we say WebAssembly is JavaScript, but it's a
Well,
very specialized version of JavaScript that then codes, pretty much down into assembly language, right?
right. It's
So,
bytecode. Right. 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 Right.
yeah,
Yeah.
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 So it's yeah. To say it's JavaScript is stretching the definition.
True. True. But I guess the bytecode it generates is then interpretable,
Oh
within
yeah, yeah.
the
Mm.
JavaScript environment. So yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Mm.
Python is the other one that I watched. Obviously, I was a big Python fan
Oh yeah,
from
yeah,
way
yeah. You were
back.
the Python guy that as I remembered it in a lot of the conferences I used to go to. Mm.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And that one, so it's like the world seems to have coalesced now around that. Certainly, if you look at the things that the AIs, proudly
Mm.
claim to help you to code these days, if you're a vibe coder, like all the cool kids are,
Yeah.
and Python and JavaScript are right up there. But can you give me some?
Yeah.
Let me take you back to those days then when you started getting involved in standards for data interchange.
Mm.
Your starting point, were there projects you got involved in there where there just wasn't any standard at the time, or were you looking to replace some previous, like, Edifact type approach to
Oh,
data
well,
exchange?
I mean, for anyone here who wasn't there, it's probably hard to imagine there was a real in like 2000, 2001, and so on. There was a real thing about boutique XML formats. Everyone wanted to have their own XML format for something in a sense, and a lot of things popped up. And so sometimes you had things that were to replace an existing format. You had ISO 20022, which I've spent a lot of my life on, which is an XML format for banking and finance. And it was, set up to replace the previous ISO 15022 binary format, which itself was replacing the previous. Well, I say ISO 7775. They sort of wrapped the standard around a pre-existing format, but so there have been a number of formats, and so they started doing 2022 in 98 or 99, so very early in the XML life. But having that said, there are some financial organizations that are only just now migrating to ISO 20022 XML and off the binary messages. So it can take a long, long time to get these things in. But the early days when I was doing it, there were quite a lot of them around. So I'm just trying to think which ones. FPML, which is one that's been around ostensibly for financial derivatives, so for the very complicated things that we trade versus simple things like shares. And so anyway, and that, FPML is still being developed, although it's been somewhat taken over by a thing called CDM that was originally designed to be for blockchains. That hasn't quite taken off for messaging yet in the way they thought, but I think it's probably still coming, just a little bit more slowly. But FPML actually is super interesting because FPML is the reason why XML schema is so good. When I say so good, why it's so well supported by XML schema validators, because it wasn't in the early days. In the early days, some of the validators would support a lot of the features, but not some of the ones they didn't want to support. But the late Andrew Jacobs, who we sadly lost during COVID, he was the technical driving force behind FPML. And he basically used pretty much every single feature of XML schema. And so because none of the XML tool vendors wanted to be left out from the banking and finance market, they had to build all those features in. And so really FPML drove, in my mind, the success of XML schema in a lot of ways. So, but we had others. There was the market data definition language that was meant to send out non-real-time information about shares and bonds and other things. And I worked on that. But then in the end, it never got great interest because the companies that distribute that also distribute the live low latency stuff.
Right.
And really, the slowness of XML just didn't appeal to them, even if we were trying to say, yeah, but not for the fast stuff. So, now some other people went on to use that information to, create relational databases that turned out to be, commercially viable because the underlying data model was, sufficiently sound. But anyway, sometimes things get picked up and sometimes they don't. Then also I got to know John Bozak, the father of XML or godfather, maybe he probably prefers, but I got to know him in some of the early XML conferences, and I was lucky when I say get to know him. I got to go to drinks with him. There's a lot of my getting into XML could be related to the fact that I got to know over drinks a lot of the major people at an early stage, and that helped make me think that I could contribute to it when I knew these people as people, and they got to know me as a person. Because sometimes you go to the people who do these things can seem like demigods,
right?
And unapproachable, and people imagine they could never be that. In fact, I remember a weird thing. I went to a conference, again, in the early days of, I can't remember if it was the XML Java conference, but in that same early period. And I met this guy there, and he became my conference buddy. And then and then I happened to mention to him that I'd done some stuff in the past about literate programming tools, which
Mm.
you had touched upon previously, and he was aware of this stuff. And then suddenly, he didn't talk to me the same way anymore. He kind of
Okay.
talked up to me, which was really uncomfortable because I just wanted to talk to him the way I'd be
Okay.
talking
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
him,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
And and so, being able just to talk to people
Mm.
is something I may highly recommend to anyone, because these people
Absolutely.
aren't demigods. They're people like you and me.
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. Oh,
Mm.
actually, now that you mentioned literate programming, that's probably worthy of a little bit of a conversation.
Well, see
Uh,
that goes right back, because my before I got into IT, I was doing physics and maths at uni, and actually doing in the 90s, I was doing a lot of computational algebra. Uh, and uh, and so the thing and so what I had to do, actually, I had these very large algebraic expressions because I grew up in the stage where you would do the algebra first, and if the algebra looked okay, you might try writing a computer program. And and then the period came where actually you didn't. You wrote the computer program first to do the numerical calculation, and that looked good, you might do some algebra afterwards. So, but anyway, so I had these very complicated algebraic expressions, and I had to get them into code.
mm,
And the problem was I was quite worried about my ability to look over here at the equation and then over here at the code and kind of get it right. And so then I discovered that there was this stuff called literate programming that Donald Knuth had come up
right.
with his famous web program. Um, but somehow I actually found an Australian tool called FunnelWeb. Uh, and so anyway, I started using that, and I sort of collaborated with the guy who did it because I had a special need. Literate programming, you don't quite really have anything like it. People who've used a Jupyter notebook have a bit of a
Right.
sense of, what it's like to have mixed text and code,
Mm,
or similarly in Mathematica notebooks since long before that. But actually, in a literate program, what you do is you weave the chunks of code into output, and so you can use the same piece of code in multiple different places, if you like.
right.
But the thing is, that makes the debugging a bit fearsome. How do you get back to the original source? So I actually updated the funnelweb code so it would generate C pragmas everywhere. So it would actually take you back from
Tell you.
debugging
Right.
into the original literate source code,
Right.
which
Right.
is what
Right.
I needed. So anyway, so I had been doing this literate programming to help myself, right, with my thesis work. And then anyway, in 1997, a lovely Canadian guy, Murray Maloney, rang me up out of the blue.
From
And he
soft quad,
said,
was it? Was he in soft? Was he soft quad?
yes, he was softcore.
Ah, okay.
Yeah,
Yeah. I
yeah.
remember him. Yeah.
And so anyway, he said, listen, I don't know if you know that the W3C conference is going to be in your hometown of Brisbane this year. I said, I do know because I went to Osweb last year, but I can't go this year to the W3C conference because it's too expensive for the university that I was working for at the time. And anyway, he said, well, we're having an XML developers day, he said. And the thing is, we've got a guy called Ted Nelson coming
Hmm.
and to do a keynote, but Ted's a little bit flaky, and we can't be quite sure if he's going to turn up. So we want to have a backup talk. And he said, and it struck me that uh, XML and literate programming might be something that would go together. And I said, well, yes, absolutely, because I was aware of SGML and stuff around that time. I had like many other people, I had looked at SGML and said they're very complex, but I like those tags. I might steal that. I remember
Hmm.
building myself a simple sort of tagged parser, to read tagged information. I never liked DTDs, by the way. I just always found they had too little the schema information that I needed. It's probably why I was more attracted to XML schema later on. So anyway, I ended up writing a paper, I mean a presentation, which I didn't give because, by the way, Ted turned up
Okay.
with two staplers and six pens hanging around his neck and stuff because he famously felt he didn't have any short-term memory, so he needed to write everything down and staple it right at the moment he thought of it. But I did write a presentation on how you might use XML for literate programming. So
Okay.
anyway, I guess from that point I was sort of into it, and then by chance the next year I moved to Sydney, and somebody put me in touch with a recruiter who got me a Java job working for a subsidiary of Reuters. Um, Now, Reuters at the time had many international mailing lists, and there was one about XML. And so people noticed that I was answering a lot of questions on it. And then in 99, my managing director came to me and said, listen, there's a guy in London who's the leader of XML architecture and design for Reuters, and he's got some money to bring people from around the empire to do 6 months of intensive XML. Would you like to do that? And I said, well, sure, I'd love to do that. Yeah, if we can do the timing right, because as it was, my first child was going to arrive, and so as his mum would be off work, it would be a good time to travel. And anyway, and then 3 weeks before, my managing director calls me in again, and he says, listen, all the other people who are coming, their bosses have reneged. So you're the only one who's going, and the guy you're going to work with has taken a job in New York. So would you like his job? And so with 3 weeks notice, I was offered the job of leader of XML architecture and design for Reuters. And
Right.
so, so anyway, and Reuters at the time, this was kind of towards the end of its glory days, but back at the
Wow.
time I joined, Reuters somehow was British Airways' single biggest business class customer, and not the biggest company in the world. I think we probably had, did we have 50,000 people? Maybe. Anyway,
Wow.
still, it seems surprising to me. But so one of the things about that was there was a lot of air travel available. And so I had the opportunity to go to a great many of the early XML conferences and meet a lot of people, and which was very helpful for me. So and then sad, we had the sort of crash in 2001 that led to Reuters crashing in 2002 and divesting itself of all the services of a lot of us. So, but I managed to stick it out and in London and find XML work for myself.
Right.
But interestingly, though, a lot of the early work I had after that crash was based on this FPML format for financial derivatives, which had been part of the crash. Some of the things that happened with financial derivatives, but actually, people didn't want to use the XML for anything. They wanted me to they wanted to use the implied data model in FPML and use it to create a new data model for them. And maybe they'd use FPML as well for some things, but really a lot of the early work was reusing the data model that had been built because people had lost faith in their own data models.
Right.
And so it wasn't actually until some years later when a company called SwapStream, I think, that was the name at one point anyway, actually started using FPML as a format for trading.
Um,
But until we had a period of some years, really, until the trading platform actually made the XML viable in its own right.
right. Right. Right.
So it's just funny how those things go.
No, indeed. And when you were extracting the implied data model, you were extracting it directly into some sort of programming language for particular customers. Is that it, as opposed
I
to
was
another
I
syntax?
was probably doing it as Java at that point, but
Okay.
a lot of
Okay.
things. So yes, and so this has also been a part of my career. I am to some extent a meta modeler. A lot of what I've done, especially these days, is to do with the fact that not just I model stuff, but I understand how to model modeling languages. And I've had to do that because when you a lot of work has been transforming things.
Oh,
I really appreciated the fact you were talking. James was talking in the recent podcast about how he thought it wasn't always helpful to write every XML related thing in XML, and that sometimes it's easier in text. And while I understand that, I've benefited enormously from the fact that XML schemas are written in XML because I've processed them,
right,
in order to get information out of them. And even XSLT style sheets, I've sometimes processed them to,
right.
enrich them, do things like that. So, and if I hadn't had that, if that hadn't been the case, I would have had to find some other parser for
Right.
them. And then, would the parser do everything? I mean, you know, and not having to find parsers was actually, for me, one of the handy things about XML formats, because you just pick up an XML parser, you had it, and then you just sort of go from there.
Right, right.
So a lot of what I've had to do is transforming, because when you work in XML in big organizations, you're constantly between the relational database people
Right,
and the object people,
right.
and so you have these three forms of that the data lives in, and each of the groups considers themselves to be the most important form.
Of course.
So the database people say, well, this is the most important form because this is where the data, is persisted overnight. And the Java people say, well, no, this is the most important format because this is where stuff actually happens. And then the XML people would say, well, if it wasn't for us, you guys couldn't even talk to each other. So we're the,
Agree.
we're the lubrication that makes everything work. And in a sense, they're all right, and in a sense, they're all wrong about being the most important because you need all of them. But
Mhm.
being forced to look across all of them and see the differences
Right, really right.
teaches you a great deal about how data models work and about understanding the isms that you get,
Ism.
XML isms that an XML schema will force on a data model, or the table isms that a relational model will
Right,
force on data
right,
model.
right.
Mm,
I guess one of the ways I like to look at it is, in the event of a disaster and the fire alarm has gone off,
mm.
and you're in the data center,
Yes.
you can take one of the three formats with you out the door. You know,
Yes,
you
that's
could take the
right.
database, you could take the Java, or you could take the XML.
Yes.
I guess in a nice simple clean world, the answer is, well, you take the XML because from that you can, it's the serialization syntax, right? You can rehydrate the data model. You could rehydrate the on the database side and on the JavaScript side, or on the Java web application server side.
Mm.
But I guess the bit that's always been problematic is that the meaning of information, and you know this better than most people, the meaning of information is often only partly in the serialization of the information. A bunch of it is encoded in the logic, for want of a better word, that sits either
Well,
within the
yes.
database or within the app server. And like without that logic, you've
Mm.
actually lost a bunch of the semantics of the data. It's not as simple as just take the XML and go.
No, that's very true. You do have. I mean, as an aside, I think this is one of the things that knowledge graphs and some of that, semantic web technology is supposed to bring. The idea that you can embed so much, not just the data, but so much of the metadata around it in that you might be able to use generic processing rules rather than
Right,
have very specific out of band rules in the code
right,
that are kind of hidden if you're only looking at the data or metadata side of it. So,
right,
but yeah, no, that's very true. And one of the big things with data models is around how they're documented.
right.
It's terrible sometimes. I can remember at an employer I was at where I was talking to an upstream system about the feed they were sending, this XML feed they were sending. And I said, listen, could you give me the documentation for it? And they said, well, what do you mean by documentation? And I said, well, do you have an XML schema? And they said, oh yeah, we've got an XML schema. And I said, oh good, send me that. And they sent me an XML schema that had zero documentation in it.
Right, right, right.
And I said, well, hold on, that's not good enough. Where's the actual documentation? And they said to me, oh look, we've been sending this to you guys for 20 years. You must have documentation. And I said, no, it does not work that way. So and it's hard. Gets no easier now when you have developers who say, my code is the documentation.
Right, right, right.
I'd be hard pressed not to fall over and laugh anytime somebody tries to say that to me, because it doesn't work. I remember a great story. Someone was telling me that they'd written the most incredible 3 lines of JavaScript, functional JavaScript. The first 2 lines each returned a function that was called in the next line. And they were so proud of it. But they said in 2 weeks afterwards, they couldn't remember how it worked.
Right. No one knows. Right, right.
Including this is the problem.
Yeah.
And this is actually why, also with my literate background, I really do most of my coding now in Jupyter notebooks, because I like to build an awful lot of discussion around my code and about how it works and about what I'm trying to do with it. Now, interestingly, I've been playing with vibe coding as well recently, because it's the fashionable thing to do.
It's the fashionable thing, yeah.
But one of the things you do to get a good result, you have to write a very detailed description of what you want, and sometimes you might start to wonder if the length of the description is rivaling the length of the code. But one thing I did think was that, I should take that prompt now, and that should be like a centerpiece of my documentation, because here in those instructions, I really captured what my goal is, what my aim is for the code, in a way that you would rarely see captured in the documentation for a piece of code. So, I think that, that could turn out to be a really useful part of writing.
I agree. It's, the whole vibe coding thing, has really turned a bunch of my world upside down. I have to say, I find that there's a really interesting alternative way of looking at the universe, extremely foreign to me in the first instance.
Yes.
But it's growing on me. So, for example, one of the things that I find myself doing now is I'm doing iterative development, by just prompting the AI. Sometimes, for example, I don't even start with a prompt. I would start with a specification document. That's a PDF.
Right.
That describes, for example, a business process. So step number 1 is say, hey, AI, read this. And then get it, the equivalent of just throwing it at a wall and see if it sticks. Just basically say to the AI, okay, well, give me a web application based on that, like a single page web app with some sort of user interface.
Yes.
And iterate the process from there. And there's a whole bunch of, toing and froing and changing your mind and so on. But at the end of it, you can ask the AI then to regenerate a clean prompt. So in a sense, what you end up getting is, after maybe a couple of hours of trying something and changing your mind and so on, you then can get a clean prompt with which you can, prompt the AI afresh tomorrow morning. And, it will regenerate the app.
Wow.
It's really interesting.
You might have hoped it would. I mean, I don't know what will classify as a clean prompt, but last week we had the 25th anniversary of the XML Summer School in Oxford.
All right.
And I live in Oxford now, and anyway, I spoke at some of the earlier ones, and so they very nicely asked me to come back again. And they they had they have a trends and transients day each year. They said, could you do something for that? So I decided, oddly enough, I'd done a little vibe coding experiment where I wanted to write a simple little sort of XML utility to do a bit of processing on some stuff in Java. I had to be in Java to fit with some other code. And I just thought, I could do that, but I'm going to be looking up so many things because I just haven't done it for a while. And so I just decided to kind of, vibe code it and just describe it. And actually it did pretty well. The only line it left out was the one where you had to tell it to be XML namespace aware. which is an interesting one because I obviously didn't describe that because you normally wouldn't think of having to say, oh, by the way, make the XML namespace aware or the parsing namespace aware. And it didn't think to ask me if that's what I was doing. And so when the code didn't work, and luckily I knew enough to see what the problem was. But anyway, uh, besides that one problem though, it worked. And so that made me think as we kind of reach these sunset years in some way for a lot of the people who, have been XML specialists in their time, are we going to have to use things like Gen AI to help us, keep maintaining the code? As I said, there's financial organizations who are now just moving on to some XML formats.
Mm.
But in my experience, there aren't many developers that you come across who really know a great deal about XML,
Right.
because it's not been a big thing. Nobody's saying, oh, please send me to an XML course, so I can educate myself or anything like that. So,
Mm.
uh, and then what are you going to do? So my thesis was, suppose you have a good Java developer, but you need them to do some XML code. They know nothing about it. Given that ChatGPT and all the others have looked through all the source code repositories that go back now to the late 90s, and given that a lot of these things have already been done in a similar way, especially these utility things have been done by someone else. I feel like there's a good chance that they should be able to come up with it because you're not really asking for new, sort of, rocket science code. In a great, there's an awful lot of the code that's written even now is very boilerplate and probably
Right.
very similar to what someone else wrote. So it seemed to me that that would be a useful way to think of it. People will probably be vibe coding COBOL as well.
Right.
So
Right. 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 Right.
uh, and so actually, and I did that, and it sort of it worked. But actually, I found I had a lot of environmental issues in the sense that um, I run Windows 11 and inside IntelliJ IDEA where I was
Mm.
doing it, the default shell was Windows PowerShell, and then I'm watching and the thing is I was running um, Claude Sonnet as the sort of the AI within GitHub Copilot and running it in agent mode. So, there's three modes. There's ask mode, which is just like asking ChatGPT or whatever a question. There's edit mode where it can see all of the open files and do edits in them, but it doesn't see anything else. And then there's agent mode where it actually is aware of everything in the project, all the files, all the dependencies, not just the source code, but the build files and everything else. So I'm running it in agent mode because that seems like the way of the future. Um, and then I saw the scripts it was trying to run, and it's trying to run a bash script in PowerShell.
Right. Right.
And I
Right. Right.
realized something's gone wrong here. At some point, somewhere, the information about the environment in which I'm doing this should have been injected into it because surely the tools could have done that, but they
Right.
didn't.
Right.
So I had a whole separate prompt about, you're a developer assistant and you're working in IntelliJ IDEA and with this whole setup and the prompt is PowerShell and please don't use Windows batch files in here and various other things. And eventually so what I did first was I got it to the point where it could just create the project and a Java file that could log some information to the console.
Mm.
Because at that point, I knew that I'd kind of covered all of the environmental things that I needed, and
Right.
then I
Right.
could have a separate prompt.
Right.
And so I did one, but I ran that same prompt at the XML summer school live, and did it converge on the same thing? No, it didn't. I had
Right.
to give
Right.
up and go back to the pre-baked one. So now I don't know, maybe I've missed a trick on maybe I should have asked it to tell me what prompt to use
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
get it
Yeah.
to recreate the
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah. I mean, it's really interesting. It's like a whole new software development paradigm. There's a whole new
Mm,
software stack is kind of emerging in real time. And
mm,
like everyone's making it up as we go along, right? Because like new capabilities
yes.
are popping out, left, right, and center, new
Mm,
problems that need to be
yes.
solved that, that were things that weren't problems before are now problems.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
The things that were problems before are no longer problems. The economics of software development seems to be turned on its head.
Would have
It's just
been.
a really, really interesting time, I think, um, to be watching what's going on from the perspective that, say, you and I share of being able to look back, over many decades worth of
Oh, yes. Yeah, yeah.
watching this whole thing, because we both remember fax machines, we both remember,
Fax machines, yeah. I mean, to be honest, the first computer programs I wrote, they weren't punch cards, but they were mark sense cards where you had to put a black mark on instead of punching a hole.
right,
So
right.
there's a sense in which some of us have, if not the entire development of computers, certainly most of it.
Most of it. Yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
and then it's very different to have people coming in now who, have never seen a phone with a cable on it, or
Right, right,
or can't understand what life without the internet would be like, or anything
right,
like
right, right. I had this sobering moment once many years ago in San Francisco when I went to the Computer History Museum in San Francisco.
that.
And I walked around and it was like, I had one of those, I had one of those, I had
No,
one of those.
exactly. I had the same thing in the London Science Museum. I'm thinking, you bastards, that's my childhood. Those are not museum exhibits.
Absolutely. Well, Tony, it's been absolutely fantastic talking with you and taking a
Oh,
trip
thank you. I've
to the
enjoyed it.
lane of all of this. I'm not sure that I feel any younger. I doubt if you probably don't feel any younger for talking to me either. But
Oh, well, I try not to think about the age thing, but I've just enjoyed this whole series. I watched all of them, and most of them are people that I know from the
right,
past, so it's lovely for me to be able to see you sort of getting the gang together.
right, 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 right. Well, fantastic. It's great to hear that. Thanks
Mm.
very much, Tony.